Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to Visordown. My name is Toad, and this is going to be our launch review of the new Ducati Panigale V2S, which took place in Spain. And as you can see, I'm not in Spain. So we had a slight problem with the microphones that we used at the launch. So unfortunately, the audio from it was completely unusable. And as is the way with YouTube comments, they would have absolutely blown up with people telling us how crap the video was. So what we've done, we've flown back to the UK. We've borrowed one of the first V2Ss in the country from Ducati here at their Silverstone HQ. And we're going to do a very quick piece of camera to tell you how we got on at the launch over in Seville, where it was about 20 degrees warmer than it is here. It is going to be a normal Visordown review though. So what I'm going to do first and foremost is take you through the bike, tell you everything that's new, and then I'm going to tell you how it handled out there on the track. And for clarity, we only rode the V2S variant. We didn't ride the stock bike, which is the V2, and I'll tell you a little bit about the differences between that and this bike in a little while. So first and foremost, this is £16,995 in the UK, which is about £2 more than the outgoing model was, I believe. So the outgoing model was about 15,000. You've got 118 bhp, which arrives at 10,750 RPM. You've also got 68 pound-foot of torque, which arrives at 8,250 RPM. The peak power figure is down on the previous V2. The peak torque figure is about the same, but the big news for this bike is that around about 70% of the bike's maximum torque is available from 3,000 RPM right the way to the top of the rev range. From there out, really, it's a very familiar story. It's all very Panigale. We've got a front frame design, so a monocoque frame at the front. We've got Öhlins NIX suspension on this one, which is fully adjustable, and we've got an Öhlins fully adjustable rear shock absorber. Braking system is obviously going to be provided by Brembo with their Stylemma calipers, and you've got a full suite of electronics, including cornering ABS, cornering traction control. You've got wheelie control, you've got power launch control, you've got engine braking control. Basically, if it's electronic and it helps a bike to go faster on road and track, this thing has got it. This bike is the S, that's the 16,995 option. You have got the stock V2, which is slightly cheaper, so that's 14,995. With that bike, you get Showa separate function big piston forks, and you get a Sachs rear shock absorber. You get the same brakes, so you still get the Brembo Stylemma calipers, and you get basically the same electronic suite, apart from the fact that it doesn't include the Ducati launch control or the pit lane speed limiter that this bike, the V2S, gets. So that is about it. That's everything that's new with the bike, and there have been some really big changes. But one of the things that Ducati has done is they've tried to make this bike a little bit more accessible and a little bit more friendly and a little bit more user-friendly than the outgoing model, because the outgoing model was quite close in terms of performance to the Panigale V4 and also in terms of the handling dynamics. And with the move to more road-focused and accessible sports bikes, Ducati's really looked to tap into that with this particular machine. How do we get on with it on the track? Well, first and foremost, this feels a lot lighter and a lot more agile than the previous generation Panigale V2. It is a super, super nice handling bike. Out there on the track in Seville, which is a very, very technical little circuit, and being that it was only opened in sort of October or November last year, it was basically new to all of us. So for us to test this bike, it was really interesting because we had to first and foremost learn the track, and then we had to get grips with the bike once we got our heads around which way that it went. But the handling is really a keynote speech from Ducati on how to make a bike fast, fun, and more importantly for this particular model, accessible, because that's what it was. It was a very, very accessible bike. The control under braking is one of the standout features. The Brembo brakes on this thing are almost too good for the bike. It feels over-braked in that the brakes are just humongously powerful with amazing lever feel. You've got a Brembo MCS master cylinder up front there, but the braking feel is absolutely sublime. And because you've got all of that braking power is being transmitted to the bike's chassis through those Öhlins forks, which are obviously fully adjustable, the control on the brakes was just absolutely insane. So you obviously trail braking all the way up into the corner, into the apex of the corner without any problems whatsoever, because the Ducati V4 derived electronics are they've just got you back all the way to the corner apex. But that really is one of the things, because it's such a light, nimble and agile bike, and because it's got such honking great brakes on the thing, you never seem to really be in any trouble. There's only one point on the track day where I completely ballsed up and missed my apex and had to run on really, really wide. Most of the time, even if you miss your braking marker by a metre or two, you can generally pull the bike back to the apex. I've got to talk about the engine, because this engine created so many headlines when Ducati announced it, and the kind of the motorcycle fans and riders, and even some sections of the media were going a bit bananas about the fact that this was like 35 bhp down on the previous generation V2. You can feel that it's not 155 horsepower. Obviously, this is 118 bhp, and that is a big difference from 150 odd. You can obviously feel that, but what this engine gains in terms of its tractability and its rideability and its accessibility kind of means that on the circuit of Seville, we didn't miss that peak power too much. And let me explain a little bit. This is a bike's engine that has been designed and built because everybody seems to be buying into parallel twins with cross-plane cranks. And one thing's that they do really, really well is they give you loads and loads of access to low and mid-range grunt, and it just makes them so easy to ride on the road and also on particular tracks, twistier tracks, a little bit like the circuit of Seville. And that's what this engine does for the Ducati Panigale. It is by far the most accessible Panigale today. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to work that out with the power output that this thing has got. But at no point during the day when I was riding it on track in Seville did I feel that it was lacking in any particular area, because you've got so much grunt, you've got so much mid-range, and you've still got a nice rush to the top end as well. It is a very entertaining bike to ride on the track, and it's almost a shame that we didn't get to ride it on the road, because I think it's going to be even better when you get it on the road. That is going to be where this bike really, really comes into its own. What was I going to say after that? So just talking about taking it to the track, this is a bike that Ducati wants to see less experienced riders getting on. It wants to see riders who might not have the experience of riding V4 or the old V2 Panigale on the circuit. They want to see people getting out on them. And on that respect, this has got to be one of the most forgiving bikes that you can take to a circuit. And it's forgiving for a lot of reasons. It's much more forgiving than a 1000cc traditional 200 plus horsepower sports bike, for the obvious reasons that you're not getting battered when you're coming into the corners, because you're not doing 180 miles an hour as you approach a hairpin bend. You're not getting thrown around as you're trying to drag the thing down to the apex, and then you're not having your arms wrenched out of their sockets as you're accelerating away from the apex of the corner. So it's much, much easier to ride than a 1000, but also arguably it's probably easier to ride than a traditional inline 4-cylinder 600cc super sports bike. And the reason for that is that's one of the things that I found when I was riding it on track. If you fluff your lines or your gears on a traditional 600cc super sport bike, you will be ruining that mistake for the entire length of the straight as you wait for the engine to spool up and get in the sweet spot. But on this thing, because you've got all that grunty mid-range and low-end torque, it doesn't really matter if you're coming out of a corner on a gammy line or you've cocked up and you're a gear higher than you need to, because the engine just pulls really, really cleanly. Even the old Panigale V2, the Super Quattro engine, you kind of had to wait for the thing to get to about 3.5, 4,000 RPM before it would wake up, and then it would shoot you off down the next straight. There's none of that with this though. So in terms of learning the circuit of Seville, it was great because the corners weren't flying at us at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And also, if you did make a small mistake in one of the slower corners on the track, the engine had got everything that it needed to get you out of that situation without any fuss or bother whatsoever, which was really very good. I'm going to talk about the electronics because that's one of the things that stood out for me. In this particular road-focused sports bike segment, which has got bikes like the Aprilia RS660, Suzuki GSX-8R, Honda CBR 650R maybe, and also things like the Daytona 660, not a single one of them could touch this thing for the ability of the electronics. They are so advanced and they work so incredibly well. You know, you're getting the ABS lights flashing to tell you that the ABS is cutting in, but unless the ABS lights were flashing, you wouldn't really have any knowledge that the bike was doing anything without you asking it to. It is so nicely implemented, and the way that the ABS system and the traction control system all activates is just done with, it's so slick. You can literally just turn the electronics on and kind of just forget that they're there. Obviously, you've got the option to go full Banzai race mode if you want, turn off all the traction control and all of the ABS and all that good stuff. But really, it was nice to have that little bit of support. Another item that I really like about it is the dash. It's got a similar sort of dash to the one found on the Panigale V4. And down the right hand side, when you're in the race mode, you've got an infographic mode, and on the right hand side of the dash you've got like your traction control, your wheelie control, engine braking and ABS. And as you're riding, because you've got this really neat little switch cube over here, which is much less fussy than the one on the previous generation bike, You can just go to the assistance system that you want to adjust. You can just tap it, turn it down, turn it up, do it all as you're riding along, which is pretty cool, because most of the time on a sports bike like this, especially when you're riding on track, if you want to adjust the electronics, you're going to have to go back into the pits. So that is a really cool feature. Are there any bad bits? Kind of. Right, so there's one thing that I picked up on this, which is also something that I noticed when I was riding the Multistrada V2S in Spain a couple of weeks ago. Every now and again, when you're going from first to second or second to third gears and you're kind of quite hard and heavy on the power, you'll click up the gear and the gear lever will move, it'll click, it'll engage, and the quick shifter will kill the power to the engine, and then you'll have like a bit of an argument with itself, and then all of a sudden it'll engage, and it's like probably, I don't know, a quarter of a second, where it's like the ECU and the quick shifter and the bike's IMU all have a little fight, and then eventually it'll go into gear. It's not all the time. It's really bizarre. It's kind of almost random in how and when it happens, but it did it on the Multistrada, and there were occasions on the track when it did it on this as well. I spoke to somebody on the Multistrada launch, and they said it was a glitch with the quick shifter and it'd be sorted by the time they hit the dealers. I spoke to Ducati's lead engine designers on the launch of the Panigale, and he said it's a shifting strategy within the quick shifter which sort of shakes the basket to get the gears to engage. I don't know which one I'm believing, but it's not so much of an annoyance. It's just when you're really trying to make progress on the track, you don't want to be losing any time whatsoever. And it was just like a minuscule hesitation in forward progress before it'd engage and it would get going again. That is literally it. I really enjoyed riding this thing on the track. I didn't really have many other complaints. You may call that bullshit, but in all honesty, I just really enjoyed riding a bike on track that I could get right the way up to like 95% of what the bike could do, instead of being when you're riding a Panigale V4 or another 200 horsepower super bike on the track. You're always sort of tiptoeing around that monstrous power output and all of the electronics that it's got. So there we have it, verdict on the Panigale V2. In the hands of a mere mortal, this is probably still going to be slower on most tracks than the previous generation Super Quadro powered V2. And I know Ducati have released footage of Marc Marquez riding one on track and clocking similar lap times or the same lap times as he could, or people could, on the Super Quadro V2, but Marc Marquez is a bit of a legend and he's quite good on a motorcycle. For most normal riders, a much greater peak power output will normally...
What a lovely gentleman.
For most normal riders on a track, monstrous peak power will always outdo high corner speed and lightweight and strong brakes. But in terms of what this bike does for Ducatis and people who want to get into owning a Panigale and riding it on track, it's just brought the level down, so it's a much more accessible level. It's fun to ride, it's still exciting to ride. In the right hands, it's still going to be phenomenally fast around the circuit. But the main thing for me as a 42-year-old who's not very fit is when I was coming in from my sessions after riding this bike, I wasn't shaking, I wasn't sweating, I wasn't, blowing out of my arse. I could feel that I'd had a workout. But in terms of what the bike does, it allows you to get to that point where you're exploring the limits of the bike and you're exploring what it can do. Things like the slide by brake control, which is basically like pressing a 0 button on a PlayStation keypad as you're going into a corner, and the back end of the bike will step out. But I'd be scared to do that, and it's a bit intimidating to do that sort of thing on a fire-breathing 200 horsepower super bike. But on this, it kind of almost eggs you on to go and do it. It's like it wants you to go and explore the limits, and it wants you to go and play with it. It's an absolute corker. As I said a little bit earlier on, the electronics on this thing would eclipse everything else in that new breed of super sports bike. And while the Yamaha R9 isn't quite here yet, the launch is coming up very, very soon. I have a feeling this would probably have the better of that, even though it's got slightly less power. I just think that low weight, that tractability from that lovely little 890cc V-twin engine is just going to pretty much eclipse everything else in this class. But then again, it should, because at nearly £17,000, it's a fair old chunk of change. And I can say that a bike is as, X, Y, and Z is probably the best bike that you can go out and buy. But when you buy a bike like this, you don't choose it just with your heart, you choose it with your head as well. If you can afford to drop £17,000 on one of these new breed super sports bikes, then this looks like probably the one that you should be going for. Anyway, folks, it is absolutely Baltic out here. I've waffled on for far too long. If you like that video, please don't forget to drop a like and hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with all of our latest content. And for all the latest news, reviews and motorcycle features, get yourself over to Visordown.com.